Good evening, everybody. We're about ready to start. This is night 5 of 24 nights of live streams, breaking down the Trump-Biden peace plan, offering people a constructive alternative to politics as usual in 2024. As always, we start these sessions off with the preamble, as a reminder of our duties as Americans. So let's go ahead and recite that. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Tonight we're going to continue on the first title of the 2024 legislative package, the Trump-Biden peace plan. And we're gonna, Title 1 is Establish Justice. It's our first duty under the Constitution, and it's pretty clear that we are not living up to our potential for establishing justice that we could be. The fact that we have nearly 2 million men and women who wake up behind bars every single day. We have the largest prison population on the planet, even though we only have about 4% of the world's population. We have about 20% of the world's prison population. And one of the ways that mass incarceration has escalated over the last few decades is because of prosecutions. Prosecutions have escalated. And so tonight we're gonna look at the first half of the Weldon Angelos Prosecutorial Reform Act. You might recall that I shared the story in the findings a couple nights ago about Weldon Angelos, a man who was sentenced to 55 years of mandatory minimums for a nonviolent drug offense. And the judge apologized, but there was nothing that he could do. And there are many cases like this that mandatory minimums drive up the length of incarceration. There's other, as we talked about, self-service convictions. There are also many factors that persuade people to convict themselves rather than expecting the state to demonstrate their burden of proof. And one of the ways that happens again is mandatory minimums. When prosecutors choose to charge someone with a mandatory minimum, and especially with a large mandatory minimum, as a way of persuading them to make a deal, to take a deal, and to just plead guilty, no matter the facts of the case. Some of the other things that we'll be talking about tonight are cash bail, and reforming and restricting the use of cash bail, and what else? Oh, civil asset forfeiture. Civil asset forfeiture is first up. Let's go ahead and start digging into this. Civil asset forfeiture. Wow. If you've been watching these live streams, you know that I am on a 24-day fast, inviting people to join me for the last 24 hours on the 24th day, October 15th, in a fast for peace, to de-escalate the election, bring people together around the solutions encapsulated within the Trump-Biden peace plan, ending poverty, ending mass incarceration, ending the endless wars. Been drinking a little more water today, so my weight hasn't changed. It's still at 198 pounds, and feeling good. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we're going to start looking at Weldon Angelos Prosecutorial Reform Act. Okay. All right. Section 131, straightforward, just a short title. Section 132, ending federal civil asset forfeiture. No person shall be required under the laws of the United States to forfeit to the United States any property, real or personal, pursuant to a civil forfeiture proceeding, including a non-judicial civil forfeiture proceeding. Basically, you need to be convicted of something in order for the United States to take your stuff. That's pretty straightforward as far as the text, but let's go ahead and talk a little bit about why civil asset forfeiture is in such need of reform. Civil asset forfeiture has been around for a long time. You can think of back in, the days of pirates or smugglers and things like that, right? That if you had smugglers who abandoned their ship and then the United States came across their ship with all their stuff, well, who do you charge with it? What do you do with that property? And so civil asset forfeiture was a way of claiming that stuff. That is, doesn't really happen so much these days. But what does happen is that people get their stuff taken without even being charged with a crime. And that's the definition of civil asset forfeiture. So when law enforcement takes property, usually cash or maybe cars or other property, that's connected with crime, but they don't actually charge someone for a crime. And billions and billions of dollars are seized every year. Back in 2014, it was reported that $5 billion in assets was seized through civil asset forfeiture, while the total burglary losses in that same year were only $3.5 billion. The police were seizing more stuff than all the burglars combined. And there's lots and lots of egregious examples of how the police have used this. Once again, to tie this to the prosecutorial reforms, if the police seize your stuff and charge you with a crime, it's a lot harder to defend yourself when you don't have, when your money has been seized. And in many cases, that's exactly what is being seized. There was a case here in North Carolina in 2014, and the Department of Justice seized $107,000 from a guy named Lyndon McClellan. He was a convenience store owner, and he often deposited cash, and he got lucky. After a year, the case was dropped and he got his money back. The same year, the police seized thousands of dollars from a man who just won the lottery. And he showed them the receipts, but they took the money anyway. And so eventually, they offered to give most of it back. They were still going to keep some. And so what are you going to do? You're going to spend more on lawyers' fees than you are trying to get the cash back. So he took a deal and let them keep some of his money that he'd won in the lottery. Just the mere suspicion of a crime can be enough for the police to seize your property under civil asset forfeiture. It is an outrage that many people are upset about, and yet Congress does very little, if anything. There have been a couple members of Congress and Senator Rand Paul. He introduced legislation a few years ago to increase the burden of proof, to make sure at least you got a lawyer while you were trying to prove that you get your property back. And to also address some of the motivational aspects of it. Instead of letting the Department of Justice keep your stuff, it would go to the U.S. Treasury instead. Because he recognized the for-profit motive of civil asset forfeiture. Take the stuff and you get to keep it, unless someone puts up a really good fight to get it back. And this is, the Constitution says, right? No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And so the defenders of this practice say, well, we wrote a law that says we can, so that's due process. And the response, of course, is, well, we can repeal that law. This next section, 133, the text comes from HR 8997, which Representative Justin Amash introduced in December of 2020. And the section that we just looked at, section 132, it was sort of modeled on his language, but he left in lots of avenues for drug asset forfeiture. And since part of the Trump-Biden peace plan is ending the federal war on drugs, all that stuff got scrapped. So we have a much slimmer version in the Trump-Biden peace plan. But the next section, 133, let me go ahead and share my screen again and we'll go through this. Section 133. It is the sense of Congress that the Constitution authorizes and obligates Congress to prohibit the use of civil asset forfeiture by the states. And so, states are free agents in many ways. There's limits on what the Congress can dictate to the states what they can and can't do. But what we can do is require that there has to be a criminal conviction before going into a civil asset forfeiture proceeding, and making sure that they get all the same protections applicable to criminal defendants. And if states don't, then we create a federal cause of action so that they can bring a civil action against sue the state for relief, including return of forfeited property. So states could violate this section, but this new federal cause of action will help discourage them from. Civil asset forfeiture, this is one of these things that is technically colorblind on its face, but it doesn't tend to work out that way. There was a 2015 study by the ACLU of Pennsylvania that found that 63% of Philadelphia cash forfeitures involved money taken from black residents, who made up only 43% of the city's population. And 71% had cash forfeited without being convicted of a crime. There was another investigation in South Carolina that determined black men represented 65% of all citizens targeted for civil asset forfeiture, even though they only made up 13% of the state's population, and that white people were twice as likely to get their money back. Of course, even if you get your money back, it's still, it can be a huge, giant hassle to deal with that, and that can have its own set of consequences, right? There was a case in Virginia in August 2012, a guy named Angelos Stewart, and he and his girlfriend, they got detained for hours. The police said they found 0.01 grams of marijuana and $17,550 in cash. Stewart explained he was on his way to buy supplies for his restaurant. Still, the police took him to the police station, didn't charge him with a crime and let him go, but they kept the $17,550. Took him 14 months in a lawsuit to get the money back, but he lost his restaurant. He lost his restaurant trying to fight to get his money back. So this is the kind of thing that we're going to put an end to. We're going to end civil asset forfeiture. Again, these things they happen far too often. And there was a case in, I think it was the Phoenix airport, where the police had confiscated some cash. And the person made a big deal about it on Twitter and drew enough media attention that the police went ahead and gave them their money back. And so Twitter outrage, the court of public opinion might be the best way for you to get this resolved. And the court of public opinion should not be a substitute for a well-functioning judicial system. All right. With that, let's move on from section 133, move on to section 134, which is prohibiting punishment of acquitted conduct. All right. This is crazy. If you take your case to trial and you're acquitted, you're found not guilty of some of your charges in federal court, the judge can go ahead and punish you just as if you'd been found guilty. This is so one of these prominent cases from 2005, case of Antoine Ball. He was convicted of distributing a few grams of crack cocaine, but he was acquitted of conspiring to distribute a much larger amount of drugs. And despite being acquitted, the sentencing judge held him responsible for the conspiracy and nearly quadrupled his sentence to 19 years. So Mr. Ball asked the Supreme Court to consider his case, and the court said, "Yeah, we're not interested." The court said they weren't interested in addressing this. So once again, not only did no jury convict them of the offense that the sentencing judge penalized them for, but the jury actually acquitted them. And yeah, it's hard to believe that can happen, but it can, and which is why section 134 prohibits punishment for acquitted conduct. So you can't, so this would be judgments after the effective date of the bill. And any acquitted conduct where you've been charged and adjudicated not guilty, or the case has been dismissed then you can't penalize the person for that. So court shall not consider, except for purposes of mitigating a sentence, acquitted conduct under this section. Fairly straightforward. This is a bipartisan piece of Senate legislation. Because it's a common sense reform. All right, section 135, cash bail reform. Notwithstanding any other provision of federal law, no justice, judge, or other judicial official in the court created by or under Article 3 of the Constitution of the United States may use payment of money as a condition of pretrial release in any criminal case. So the actual text is pretty straightforward. Why do we want to reduce cash bail? And sort of like civil asset forfeiture, the act of being held and on cash bail that you can't afford, which is a situation that right now, tonight, hundreds of thousands of people are sitting behind bars, not because they've been convicted of crimes, but because they can't afford, because they're held on cash bail. I looked up that quote that I was stumbling with the other night. Brian Stevenson, he said, "The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice." And so if you're wealthy, you can afford to bail out, bond out. You're not actually held in jail. But if you're not able to afford it, then you can be stuck for days, weeks, months, even years, waiting for a trial date, waiting for a court date, waiting for something to happen. Prosecutors, in the meanwhile, are hoping that you'll just give up and plead guilty. But if you want your day in court, it can take a while. There's a famous case of Caliph Browder. He was a teenage boy. He spent years on Rikers Island after his family was unable to pay his bail $3,000 for allegedly stealing a backpack. And after 3 years, they finally dropped the charges and let him go. But he spent most of that time in solitary confinement. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the solitary confinement section of this legislation. Solitary confinement can have a very negative impact on people's mental health. And Caleb Browder got his quote-unquote freedom back, but the damage that those years of solitary confinement had done eventually inspired him to take his life a few years later. Cash bail, holding people because they can't afford to pay, is destroying lives. It is not justice, and we can do better. So a number of cases, again, bail is not punishment. Bail is about ensuring that someone returns to court. Give them a quote-unquote financial incentive to not skip town, that kind of thing. But that's the theory. But in practice, it doesn't work that way. There was a study in Harris County, Texas, which is the third largest one. It's about five years ago. It found that people who were stuck in jail, not able to pay their bail, were 25% more likely to plead guilty and 43% more likely to be sentenced to jail. No one should be held simply because they can't afford to pay. And even if you can't afford to pay, you can get a bondsman, right? You can bond out of jail. Generally, how that works is you got to put up 10% of whatever the bail amount is to a for-profit bail bondsman. And the United States and Philippines are the only two nations that allow for-profit bondsmen. Because once you give them that 10%, you never see it again. You're just out of luck. So if you can't afford to bond out, but you can scrape together 10%, then, because the thing about bail is you get it back, right? Whether you're convicted, whether the charges are dropped, whatever, once your court case is resolved, you get all that money back, unless you've paid a bondsman, in which case it's just gone. You've just spent that money for the privilege of not remaining behind bars while you get your day in court. One of the interesting things to me is looking at is that it didn't used to be this way. Rosa Parks famously was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus on it was a Thursday afternoon, and the trial was on Monday. Speedy trials used to be a thing, and one of the problems with the rise of mass incarceration and the aggressive prosecutions is that our judicial system has really slowed down. And it's been said, justice delayed is justice denied. What else? We got some statistics here on New York's bail reform. Of the only 2% of those who were released on bail were rearrested for violent crimes. Yeah, okay. Anything else? I think that's it for cash bail. So this section that we just looked at, 135, deals with federal cash bail. You may recall that yesterday evening we looked at incentivizing states through the withholding of burn grants unless they reduced their the percentage of cases that involved cash bail. So once again, you're sort of limited in what states can do, what you can tell the states to do, but you can incentivize them to make less use of it. All right. I think we're going to move on to section 136. This section will repeal mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums have been around since the first criminal criminal laws signed by George Washington. The 1790 Crimes Act had 23 crimes, and seven of them had a mandatory death penalty. The rest had maximum sentences, and as we skim through these, the repeals, you'll see some of these old ones. But today, as I said the other day, the average person who's convicted under a mandatory minimum gets 144 months. Is sentenced to 144 months. So that's more than 12. That's 12 years. And as I wrote about in my novel, Looking Backward from the Tricentennial, these long sentences, we lost track. What's the point? What's the purpose? The purpose of incarceration is to rehabilitate. 97% of the people who are incarcerated are going to get out. So it's in our best interest to make sure that they're rehabilitated when they do. And these excessively long sentences don't necessarily add anything to that. So in this future vision of America in 2076, prosecutors you can't take a plea bargain for more than 4 years. If a prosecutor wants you incarcerated for longer than that, they need to demonstrate through a trial, demonstrate your guilt, and persuade a judge and jury that 4 years is an insufficient amount of time. You think 4 years ago we were swept up in a pandemic, and how much you think about how much we all change. How much we change over 4 years, over 10 years. These really long prison sentences really just waste so much human potential. And so this section doesn't get rid of any of the maximum penalties. It only eliminates the minimum penalties. Again, like Weldon Angelos, his case, to allow a judge to sentence someone to give them a fair sentence. One of the premier organization that is working on this is Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and it was founded by a woman whose brother got a 5-year mandatory minimum for growing marijuana, and there was nothing you could do about it. That's it. 5 years for growing marijuana. That was 30 years ago. I mean, today growing marijuana is big business. But all right. So before we get into looking at exactly which things are repealed by this section, let me just share some of their arguments of why mandatory minimums should be repealed. One, mandatory minimums do not deter crime and make the public safer. Deterrence, it assumes that people will research the criminal code, find out the relevant mandatory penalty, and then be discouraged because of that penalty. But in reality, criminals generally don't expect to be caught, and they're not aware of mandatory penalties when they commit a crime. And prosecutors, in many cases, have discretion over what sort of crimes that they charge a person anyway. So mandatory minimums do not deter crime. All right, 2, mandatory minimums fail to create consistency or uniformity, despite that being their objective. Again, prosecutors are the ones who decide who, when, and how to charge, and they use mandatory minimums at different rates from jurisdiction, and it creates sentencing disparities and inconsistencies. 3, mandatory minimums create a trial penalty. Once again, prosecutors can say, well, look, I'll give you a deal, 7 to 10 years, but if you go to trial, there's a 25-year mandatory minimum. Trial by jury is sort of supposed to be the cornerstone of our judicial system. The idea that the state has to make its burden of proof before taking away your freedom and liberty. But mandatory minimums create a trial penalty where people are incentivized to just cut a deal. 4, mandatory minimums create unwarranted racial disparities in sentencing. Once again, this is because so much of this is up to the discretion of prosecutors. A 2014 University of Michigan study found federal prosecutors are 65% more likely to charge black defendants with offenses that carry mandatory minimums. And that ultimately results in lengthier sentences for black defendants, contributes to racial disparities in sentencing, and other things like the drug-free school zone laws, which often require a mandatory minimum prison term for buying or selling drugs within a certain distance of a school. It impacts people of color disproportionately because people of color are more likely to live in cities and dense communities with overlapping school zones. They get hit the hardest by this. In 2000 in New Jersey, 96% of people incarcerated under the state's school zone law, 96% were black and Hispanic, prior to some reforms in 2010. It's just, again, worth reminding people that this legislative package, End Poverty, End Mass Incarceration, and the Endless Wars, are addressing Dr. King's triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. Racism is very much a part of our criminal justice system, and so it needs to be scaled back in order to address that. All right, mandatory minimum sentences are not necessary to ensure sufficient punishment because it doesn't, because you can still, like I said, this isn't going to get rid of the maximum sentences. It's just going to get rid of the minimum. So it doesn't mean that eliminating mandatory minimums is a get out of jail free card for everybody. It just means courts won't have to imprison people indiscriminately. They'll have to consider the factors that matter. And last, mandatory minimums sentences require courts to send people to prison, even if prison is unnecessary to keep the public safe. Again, the growing marijuana 30 years ago got a 5-year prison sentence. And they also keep people in prison past the point of where they pose a danger to each other. Weldon, Angelos did not need a 55-year mandatory minimum sentence in order to keep the community safe. It's also worth pointing out that in a number of countries, like Canada, courts have found mandatory minimum sentencing provisions to be unconstitutional. Other countries include India, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and Papua New Guinea. More than 30 states have reformed or repealed their mandatory minimum sentences. Louisiana did it in 2017, and when they repealed theirs in their first 6 months alone, the state saved $12 million. The prison population dropped, and the state was able to reinvest that money into crime reduction and victim support programs. 2015, Pennsylvania's mandatory minimum sentences were struck down as unconstitutional, and crime rates continued to decline as a result, along with the prison population. And Michigan, in 2002, legislators repealed almost all mandatory drug sentences, and the state's crime rate dropped 27% in the decade following the reform. Look, mandatory minimums take away the ability of judges to judge and replace it with a dictate from Congress, from Washington, on how people should be treated. A one-size-fits-all solution. That's not what we need from Washington, D.C. We don't need one-size-fits-all solutions when it comes to the criminal code. So I'm going to skim through the section 136. It is, there's a lot of pages in it, so we're just going to skim through it. Some of these, I had a breakdown at one point. I don't remember where it is, but there's a breakdown. So this one is just a 1 month mandatory minimum. Some of them are longer. It's less than 6 months, not less than 30 days, 6 months. So some of these, and again, they're all spelled out in the legislation so that you can see exactly what it is that is being changed and being amended by this legislative package. Here is a mandatory minimum of 10 years, and now it's been changed to not more than 10 years, so up to 10 years. There are a couple in here on pirating. I wanted to flag. I don't know what a ballistic knife is, but it has a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence. Again, crimes that are punishable by death, that is subject to, it says where the current law says punished by death or imprisoned for life, mandatory minimum of life imprisonment. The text has changed to subject to imprisonment for any term of years, or the death penalty, or life imprisonment. So maximums stay the same, but the minimums are removed. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of things in here. A violation involving a motor vehicle that carried high-level radioactive waste at a 30-year mandatory minimum. This is, again, leaves that a maximum of life imprisonment is still in place. Let's see, where is there's a couple in here. Okay, yeah, whoever on the high seas commits piracy as defined by the law of nations shall be subject to imprisonment for any term of years or life. So these are some of the really old codes relating to piracy with mandatory life sentences. And this was one, I thought, whoever being a seaman lays violent hands on his commander to hinder and prevent his fighting in defense of his vessel or the goods entrusted to him is a pirate and shall be imprisoned for life. That seems pretty harsh, but the maximum penalty of life imprisonment would still be on the books. Yeah, so there is quite a few of these. 20, let's see. So we get up to WZZ, and then, so that's 50, 26, 52, 57. So 59, at least 59 mandatory minimums. Should be all of them struck from the United States Code. All right, now we're on to section 137, clarifying certain offenses related to espionage. Espionage, that sounds pretty scary, huh? Well, if we go to the dictionary, you know what espionage actually means. According to Webster's College Dictionary, New World, 5th edition, espionage is the act of spying. It is the use of spies by a government to learn the military secrets of other nations, or the use of spies in industry, or by industry in commerce to learn the secrets of other companies. That's what espionage is, spying. However, over the last in recent years, the Espionage Act has been used to go after whistleblowers. We'll go in 2010, Thomas Drake, he criticized the Trailblazer program, which tracked people using cell phones and emails, and he complained about it to superiors about privacy and other management problems. And then they charged him under the Espionage Act as a warning. If you rock the boat, here's what we can hang you with. Because the thing about the Espionage Act is it doesn't have to prove that there's any intent to harm the country. We're gonna look at the text here in just a few minutes. And in fact, when this Espionage Act of 1917 was first passed, basically anything, it was passed during 1917, so World War I, and anything that might throw sand in the gears of the war machine could be considered espionage. There's a book called American Midnight that looks at that period of American history, like 1917, 1921. And there's one case where a guy made a movie about, I think it was The Spirit of 76 or something like that, and about the American Revolution. Well, guess who the bad guy is in the American Revolution? That's the British. And in World War I, the British were our allies. And so he got 5 years, I believe, sentenced to 5 years for showing a film that portrayed our ally in a negative light. Eugene Debs, he gave a speech encouraging people not to go to war. Eugene Debs was was the socialist candidate for president many times, including in 1920 from inside his cell. But he was a committed pacifist and encouraged people not to go fight. And he got a 10-year sentence under the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act was really abused in those early days. Like I said, anybody who tried to throw sand in the gears of war, the war machine. And it's being abused again in recent days, primarily to go after whistleblowers. One of the biggest whistleblowers was about 10 years ago was Edward Snowden, where he revealed the National Security Agency, the NSA. It was spying on Americans through a variety of programs, including collecting bulk telephone data, scanning private emails, and he witnessed the Director of National Intelligence lie under oath to Congress, and so he realized something had to be done. He's got this great quote: "I had been looking for leaders, but I realized that leadership was about being the first to act." And so for his leadership in revealing to the American people what was being done in their names by our government, he was charged under the Espionage Act. So he is the State Department canceled his passport while he was on a plane while he was in Asia, and so he got stranded in Russia because his passport has been canceled. He's been there since 2013 and will likely remain there unless the espionage is amended, as we'll take a look at in a second. Sort of as a postscript to this story, in 2020, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the bulk collection program was illegal. And so despite the fact that he revealed something illegal, nefarious activity was going on, he's still under the threat of prosecution. The espionage was also used in 2017 to go after Reality Winner. She mailed one sheet of paper to the press showing that Russia had tried to interfere in the 2016 election. And for that, she was sentenced to 5 years, 65 months, I believe. And she finally got released after a few years later. Julian Assange was another one. He was kept for, he was the co-founder of WikiLeaks, and when he published on WikiLeaks videos of American soldiers in Iraq shooting civilians, including journalists from helicopters, he got international attention, and they published WikiLeaks published many thousands of field reports, diplomatic cables, and revealed that the United States wasn't just spying on our own citizens, but our own allies. You think that might be considered espionage, huh? Anyways, Obama he went after other whistleblowers, but he didn't go after Julian Assange because it was different, because they were publishing this information. Publishing government documents is protected under the First Amendment, freedom of the press. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were published by the New York Times, showing how the American people were being lied to about the escalation of the Vietnam War. And when the government got an injunction against the New York Times, the Washington Post picked it up, and then 15 other papers. And the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the press couldn't be restrained. So, I said Obama did not go after Julian Assange, but President Trump did. And President Biden continued the efforts to extradite Julian Assange, leaving him stuck in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for 7 years. And then in 2019, he was arrested and thrown into the maximum security Belmarsh prison, charged with 17 counts under the Espionage Act. Even though, again, publishing government secrets is freedom of the press. So let's go ahead and take a look at the text of these amendments to the Espionage Act. Basically, what we're doing is requiring a specific intent to injure the United States. So this is subsections 793 A through E of Title 18 United States Code. So you can hear not a reason to believe that the information, you need to have a specific intent to harm the United States. B, striking the reason to believe, but an actual intent to take, copy something that is classified, not merely just connected with the national defense, but actually classified information. Again, C, adding properly, requiring that something be properly classified as connected with the national defense, as opposed to prosecutors after the fact being able to say, oh, this is relevant to national defense, sort of like the filmmaker back in 1917. Again, if you're guilty if you have possession of these things with the specific intent to injure the United States or advantage any foreign nation. Unauthorized possession with the specific intent to injure the United States or advantage any foreign nation. Remember I talked about Thomas Drake, one of the first people to be charged recently under this act back in 2010. And it was this very specific section that he was charged with espionage, because they said he had unauthorized possession of something. No intent to injure the United States or to help anyone else. But they said, well, it could be used harmfully, and therefore that's espionage. Again, so just adding more protections, knowing willfully with the intent to injure the United States or advantage a foreign nation. And then creates most of this language comes from legislation introduced by Tulsi Gabbard, I want to say it was the Protect Brave Whistleblowers Act. And so this creates an authority to disclose to members of Congress, inspector generals, oversight boards, if they have if they have procedures and things to do that. Testimony of purpose. So one of the other things about the Espionage Act is that if it's classified information, you're not necessarily allowed to talk about it in court. This is what happened to Reality Winner. That had she gone to trial, she wouldn't have been able to offer any testimony about the purpose of informing the American people that Russia had tried to interfere in the election. And so this adds that a defendant charged with these offenses shall be permitted to testify about their purpose for engaging in the prohibited conduct. And it also creates an affirmative defense if the purpose was for disclosing to the public any violation of any law, rule, regulation, or gross mismanagement, gross waste of funds, and abuse of authority, things that the public should be informed about, then that can be an affirmative defense to a charge of espionage. All right, I think that's it for covering the Weldon Angelos Justice Act. I'm not seeing any questions on any of these sections in the chat. Tomorrow, we're gonna do it tomorrow. Let's say tonight's Wednesday, tomorrow's Thursday. Tomorrow I'm gonna do a recap day and talk a little bit more about some of the, a little more of the framework for some of these things. So Friday evening, we will tackle part 2 of the Weldon Angelos Prosecutorial Reform Act, which is ending the federal war on drugs. So we'll do that Friday at 7 p.m. But tomorrow we'll, if you have any questions on anything we've covered so far, please bring your questions on Thursday evening. And I think that's about it for tonight. Again, what can you do to help enact the Trump-Biden peace plan? You can help us create the leverage by breaking the polls, by insisting to pollsters that you are a true swing voter, that you will vote for both Republicans and Democrats depending on who gets the American Union endorsement. Second, you can become a dues-paying member at anamericanunion.com, 25 cents a day, $7 a month. And 3, to opt in to pooling your votes, join with me and others around the world in a fast for peace on Tuesday, October 15th, 3 weeks before the general election. And we will create a positive moral pressure. We're going to offer people a positive vision for what the United States can do instead of this very negative election. Once again, as it is every 4 years, every 2 years, it is the most important election of our lifetime. But we're not moving this country forward. And we talked about with the Phoenix cycle, we are at a time of cyclical change. We have the opportunity to shift the direction that our country is going in. And we can shift it in a positive way by being conscientious objectors to this endless war of politics, and instead unionizing as swing voters to be the calmer heads that prevail. All right, I think that's it. I hope to see you tomorrow evening at 7 p.m.